Hello, I'm Annie Graham Larkin, Executive Director of the Bisbee Mining and Historical Museum. Welcome to Company Town, USA, Arizona Copper and American Capitalism, a book update with Dr. Katie Benton-Cohen. Thank you to our members and donors who enable the museum to provide free online programming and fulfill the organization's mission to discover history, explore Bisbee's past today. To learn how you can assist the museum in supporting its mission and programs by becoming a member or donor, please visit bisbeemuseum.org. On Saturday, March 14th at 11 a.m., the museum will host the free online program Early Bisbee with Richard Graham IV and yours truly, Annie Graham Larkin. To register or for more information, visit the events section of the Bisbee Mining and Historical Museum's website or Facebook page. Okay. Dr. Katie Benton-Cohen is an Arizona native and teaches history at Georgetown University. She is the author of two books, including Borderline Americans, Racial Division and Labor War in the Arizona Borderlands, which is a history of Cochise County. She was also the historical advisor for the film Bisbee 17. And if you would like to ask any questions to Dr. Benton-Cohen today, please use your Q&A chat box, and we will gather those to share with our speaker after the presentation. Also, a link to the recording of the program will be sent to all of our Zoom registrants later today. And with that, I'd like to welcome Dr. Katie Benton-Cohen. Thank you for joining us yet again.
Hi, everyone. I took a look at the participants and I see some old friends. I don't mean you're old. I mean, we've been friends a long time. And some new ones, people I've interacted with in various ways. And I really want to say thank you for joining me on a Saturday. I also want to say there's some construction noise upstairs. I have one child who has fled the nest, and so we're turning his room into a master bedroom. So there's some construction going on there. And I also am reminded that Annie told me that everything I say will live forever on the internet. So I will try not to be my usual overly pesky self. What I hope to do today is give you an update on how my project is going. If you find the noise back there too loud, Annie, let me know, and I will put on headphones.
Will do.
Okay. Yeah, just pop up and say it in person like that. So some of you know me, some of you don't. The short background that I want to say here is that I wrote Borderline Americans. I lived in Bisbee and got to know some of you. I hate to say it, but it's like more than 25 years ago. And then my work as historical advisor on Bisbee 17 made me re-curious about kind of the larger history of Phelps Dodge and the family. And I lived in Bisbee in the spring of 2024 with my husband and younger son. And I know that this project, for those who care about it, is taking a really long time, but a lot of things happen in between, you know, my job and my life. But I really wanted to come today to share an update about where the project is and essentially give you a kind of vibe check. Hold on, my door seems to have opened. Sorry, that was the dog. So right now, the project as I currently envision it, which I've been able to work on pretty much full-time last fall and this spring, is the title keeps changing. My working title for this talk is kind of what I'm thinking about for the book, which is Company Town, USA, Arizona Copper and American Capitalism. And this comes out of conversations with an agent who wants to help me sell the book to a major publisher. And if you want to talk to me about that process, I'm happy to share that. That's been a journey. The idea there is so that this story can reach a wider audience. So one of the things when I talk to folks who really care about Bisbee and Phelps Dodge more generally is that I am often sharing things that you know really, really well and that I need you to help me get right. But also I have to do it with an eye toward what's the story that really tells a broader story for people who don't know about these wonderful places and this fascinating history? What's the takeaway for some general reader in a bookstore in Phoenix or Chicago? And with that in mind, what I'm envisioning for the book now is a history of Phelps Dodge, focusing on three of its company towns, Bisbee, Clifton, Morenci, and Plius, although obviously other places come up fairly often, that tells the story of Phelps Dodge's rise from its New York roots through its sale to Freeport-McMoRan in the 2000s as a kind of pocket history of American capitalism. And that by using Bisbee, Clifton, Morenci, and Plius as case studies, we can see three different outcomes for extractive capitalism in the age of the financialization of corporations. So what I mean by that is we see how Clifton and Morenci start in similar ways. Bisbee is a bigger operation, Copper Queen, until World War II. I'll walk through this. What happens in Bisbee after Copper Queen closes, in contrast to Morenci being, in fact, the largest surface mine still in North America and still a true company town, as two different outcomes for this process. And Plius as a mid to late 20th century experiment in creating a new company town and trying to address the problems created by new environmental regulations and labor conflict. And its bizarre aftermath as a military and law enforcement training facility. Okay, so let me share some slides, and I'm going to just do like a really high-level overview here so you can see what I'm trying to capture in this book, and then I really welcome your Q&As about particular aspects of it, and also about process and sources, because there's some really interesting things here about my following in the footsteps of earlier Phelps Dodge historians, indeed using their documents and their interviews. So for those of you who care about historical sources or how we know what we know, that's a component of this that I find really interesting and I'm happy to talk about, but more so in the Q&A. Okay. And it doesn't want to change. All right, I've used this slide before. You may recognize this bumper sticker from Bisbee. I like to precede all my talks with this. Okay. So the background for this is stages of American capitalism that I see in Phelps Dodge's history, and some of you may have seen me mention these before. We can think of, if I were teaching US history survey like I do to Georgetown undergraduates, sometimes you can see a kind of larger arc of American history here. The mercantile capitalism that Phelps Dodge as a young trading company engaged in. The phase of heavy development, I would even say, speculation in railroads and lumbering in Pennsylvania and Georgia. And then, of course, the momentous turn toward investment in Clifton and Bisbee in 1880, 1881 were simultaneous with the rise of extractive industrial capitalism in the United States and the rise of copper mining as a mass production and high demand product in the age of electricity and telegrams and telephones and military development. And then their move toward early mid to 20th century manufacturing and vertical integration, these things that our high school US history classes teach about vertical integration, right? All the means of production and horizontal integration, controlling the industry. Those things were both happening, right, with the rise of manufacturing, smelting, milling, even selling commercial finished products from their roots in being wholesale merchants of metals and cotton. The Depression and World War II turn out to be a wonderful, Phelps Dodge turns out to be a fantastic case study for the rise of federal military government spending and the ways that it propped up and promoted certain industries. That is how Morenci went from being less important in Phelps Dodge's history to more important than Bisbee, with this huge infusion of federal money for in the defense era in early World War II that started open pit mining there in large quantity. And then the general 20th century era of paternalism and company town provision that is also anti-union, and the fights of the unions for representation in the 1930s and 1940s that result in the contract era, what historians have called business unionism, where unions and corporations, although it appears they're adversarial, in some ways they work together with negotiated labor contracts. And of course, the end of that with the 83 strike, and the belt tightening, which many Phelps Dodge observers and actual managers called the lean and mean era. So you'll see that in my next slide. So my current structure of the book is three main sections, what I call patrimony, which is what the Phelps Dodge family felt indebted to and the paternalism and piety that they learned in New York City in their Presbyterian evangelical circles, the ways that they envisioned these kind of idealized company towns, and what they felt were their obligations to those communities. And then those move forward as they were already really wealthy, but like next level wealthy. And the incorporation of Phelps Dodge, the incorporation of towns, the incorporation of communities. And I would also say, as a US historian, the incorporation of America, where corporate life and corporate organization of business becomes a mass national phenomenon. And then the third section I call lean and mean, referring to the numerous ways that is how the numerous times I see the press and officials actually describe the post 83 strike managerial approach of Phelps Dodge. And then the last section of the book is what I call afterlife, what happens to Clifton Morency, Plius, and Bisbee, and that includes my own personal experiences. So I have again showed this slide in talks various people have seen. This is an overview of some of the big moments. There are many more. I have a pages long timeline, but these are helpful for you in what I'm going to talk about going forward. So these are the various ways in which the business was organized. Okay. Here is an early ad for Phelps Dodge at the corner of it was at the corner of Cliff and Fulton Streets in Wall Street, in the Wall Street area, just a few blocks from South Street Seaport. Actually, as a matter of fact, I have something to show you. So this is, I know that's not going to work. Hold on. Let's see. I can't get it to show. Oh, sorry. Okay. It's too glossy. That is the desk of Anson Phelps from their New York office, which is now held at the South Street Seaport Museum, because they were part of a large group of warehouses and wholesale merchants in that region of New York. And here in 1832 was Phelps Dodge's first large disaster. We all think of copper mining and smelting as very dangerous jobs. They are among the most dangerous jobs in the United States. But Phelps Dodge had fatal tragedies even before it entered the mining industry. In 1832, Phelps Dodge built one of the largest, fanciest warehouses in the area. And it had been open less than a month, but they overfilled it with literally tons and tons and tons of tin and brass and cotton wholesale plates that they plan to ship out, as well as you might see there cotton, Southern plantation cotton. Yes, they were engaged in trading cotton picked and processed by enslaved people in the South. And the entire 6-story building collapsed. Various numbers, 5 to 8 people died. Importantly, one of them was Josiah Stokes, who was supposed to be the third son-in-law of Anson Phelps, though, you know, that many of you probably know. Anson Phelps was a Connecticut Yankee who moved to New York with his first partner, Elisha Peck, and started this trading firm. And then Anson Phelps was a very pious man, and he held a Bible study group for young men in his home with his wife, Olivia Phelps, where he handpicked his sons-in-law, Daniel James, who moved to Liverpool to manage the English side of the business, William E. Dodge, who's the Dodge in Phelps Dodge, and then this young man, Josiah Stokes, who was essentially Phelps's personal assistant. And Stokes died in the collapse before he was able to marry Anson Phelps's daughter. An interesting postscript to that is that his brother, Joseph Phelps, a few years later, married her instead. So they still got a Phelps son-in-law out of the deal. They left the business in the 1870s, but that is a kind of really important origin story for Phelps Dodge, because they kind of had to rise from this disaster that was very, very public, well publicized. This is an etching that was in a New York paper. And I use that's actually in the first chapter of my book, and I use it to show, it literally reveals, right, what they were invested in, and danger and family and their role in the business. Then I move on. So there are two chapters about early New York. The first one starts with the disaster, and then the second one moves on to after Anson Phelps dies in the 1850s, and William E. Dodge becomes kind of the heir apparent to the business. William E. Dodge, like Anson Phelps, is involved in a lot of philanthropy. And before he dies in 1844, Anson Phelps founds Phelps Dodge's first company town, a place called Ansonia, Connecticut. And it's a brass foundry town, and it's in the Connecticut Valley, where there's a lot of industrial work. And it is not as full-blown as later Phelps Dodge company towns are, but it shares, it is certainly a model for the subsequent generations as they envision their company towns in the Southwest. As a generation later, they build a church. His daughters endow a library. They hire the minister for the church, and things like that. William E. Dodge is called the Merchant Prince of Manhattan. He's in the first New York Chamber of Congress and Chamber of Commerce. I'm looking at the word Congress. And then he serves one term in the House of Representatives, representing New York as a kind of peace Republican in the Reconstruction era. And I've given a talk before in Bisbee, but I want to share again on this, where I found the letters between him and his brother-in-law, because they're so extraordinary, where they're writing in 1860 and 1861 about the coming of the Civil War. And in some of these later letters, this is a really amazing insight into how prosperous businesses handled the uncertainty of the economy during the Civil War. The Navy was one of their biggest clients, providing brass for naval ships. But at the same time, obviously, the embargoes, the disruption of the cotton economy were all concerns for the business. And we can see that in their correspondence with each other, as well as, of course, as a family that had been involved in the abolitionist colonization movement for a very long time, and were deeply interested in what the outcome of the war would be. So here are, again, some correspondence between them. And also you can see here that Dodge plays a really important role. He's a leading figure in New York, and he is tasked by Abraham Lincoln to help with many things. In 1862, when the New York draft riots break out, which are largely Irish immigrants who lean Democratic, who really don't want to fight a war to free slaves, they have a riot and they burn down and pillage many parts of Black New York. And Dodge is one of the leaders in kind of handling the recovery of that. All right, and then part two of the book, Incorporation, begins with this fateful meeting in 1880 at Phelps Dodge's newly reconstructed headquarters in downtown New York, in which a man comes in sharing some information about Morenci, um, saying, I'd like you to make this investment. I'd like 30, or the numbers vary in the different versions, 30 or $40,000 for you to come invest in my mining operation in this town in the middle of nowhere that no one has ever heard of. And these are extremely rich, fancy New Yorkers who live in mansions and estates. But they know Dr. James Douglas from his work for them in Pennsylvania, and they decide to send Douglas, and many of you know the story, to go check out Morenci, and they add Bisbee and the Copper Queen to the list because their foundries, their brass foundry already uses copper from the Copper Queen. So they thought, let's go check out this place. And lo and behold, the famous origin story of Bisbee and Morenci becoming Phelps Dodge towns, Douglas sends back positive reports and they begin to invest. And in the book, I get much more into the weeds about William Church and Morenci and, the development in Bisbee of contestation over the claims. I know I see Gary Dillard is here. People who know those stories, and I do talk about that. And one of the things that I talk about, so let me show you this. Right. So I spent some time, this is actually when I was living in Bisbee. I went up to Tucson and looked through the ledger books for the Detroit Copper Mining Company, which was, of course, the company they first invested in Clifton. And I really like these ledger books because you can see the small beginnings of providing a company town. So you can see their expenses are things that you would expect. Mine supply, something about fuses, right? Dynamite, wheels, stone, fuel. But then we also see the things that are about sustaining a workforce: eggs, poultry, oranges, salt, 4 tubs of butter, 34 packages of, I actually can't read what that says, 2 boxes of spuds, that cracks me up, and 12 cases of canned goods. And you start to see them providing things that make a company town. In subsequent years, you start to see in those ledger books construction of the school, payment of the teacher, company housing, and you start seeing those appear in the ledger. So it's a really nice way for readers or for people who aren't familiar with company towns to see how this development happens. Well, that skipped way ahead. I wanted to tell you something about that era. Oh, and one of the things that, again, those of you who know Bisbee know, but a point I want to make in kind of a national context is that in Clifton Morenci, where Phelps Dodge and also the Arizona Copper Company, who was owned by other folks, start pushing out these initial Jewish investors that were from Las Cruces. They eventually push out Chinese miners who are working there because of protests from other workers. This reflects a kind of larger national trend, right? Where these New York investors are displacing this more diverse, kind of more on the ground Western workforce and investors. And in Bisbee, we see that with the lawsuits against Angela Diaz, who was the common law widow of somebody who had contested claims that Phelps Dodge wanted, and lawsuits against her and her removal. And then also Mrs. Crossey's store. She had a little general store in Bisbee, and she essentially gets bought out by Brophy to create Phelps Dodge Mercantile. And so again, this is an ongoing theme in US history, but we should think about it. Small, ethnic, or women business owners who are being pushed out by, now we'd say, the big chains, right? But those outside capitalists who just have they have much larger capital reserves. And I know it's funny to think about that in terms of like Pioneer Bisbee or Clifton, but that is actually what's going on. And of course, the rise of the dual wage system, where they inherit a largely Mexican workforce in Clifton Morenci who get paid less, and they inherit the district code in Bisbee of Mule Gulch of the original prospectors who, say this is a white man's camp where Mexicans can't work underground and Chinese can't live or work. And they acquiesce to those, right? That's a kind of labor relations move where Phelps Dodge says, okay, we'll agree to your terms that you have created about race and work. All right, so then I kind of moved to the, oh, actually, I want to say something. I'm looking at my time. I'm going to talk for about 16 more minutes, so then I take questions. So this is a picture from the 30s from Morenci, or the 40s, but I want to, before I talk about that, obviously I always talk about the Bisbee deportation. In this book, unlike my book, or when we think very Bisbee centrically, or unlike my first book, I have decided that I really want to highlight the strikes in Clifton, Morenci before the Bisbee deportation. So the strike 1903, 1904, which is when Harry Wheeler had just joined the Arizona Rangers and was learning about labor relations. And then in 1915, in both of these instances, as you know, these were majority Mexican-American workforces who went out on strike en masse, 5,000 workers in 1915. And they made it very clear that they wanted higher wages. As I dug into the 1915 strike in Clifton, Morenci, which I had read about before, but for this book, I'm really digging in, and I found these incredible primary sources. I found telegrams that were internal to the company and the Phelps Dodge family that are in the Cleland papers. Robert Cleland wrote the early 1950s history of Phelps Dodge, and his papers are at the Huntington Library in Pasadena. And he had a bunch of internal documents because Phelps Dodge gave him access. And what I saw there was the concern as early as 1903, 1904 of Arthur Curtis James, who was related to the family, and later the largest railroad shareholder in the United States. Obviously of Walter Douglas, general manager, and of other figures in the company. They were very concerned at the strength of union strength in Clifton, Morenci. And in 1915, when that 5,000 person workforce walked out, the general managers and foremen in Clifton, Morenci of both Phelps Dodge's Detroit Copper and the Arizona Copper Company were concerned for their safety, and they essentially self-deported. They took the company railroad to El Paso, and the Paso del Norte had just opened with its 40-foot Tiffany-style stained glass window over the lobby, and they essentially deported themselves. It was like the reverse of Bisbee, right? The managers left and stayed in El Paso for months while negotiations were underway. And once I learned about that, I thought, oh, what if we thought about the Bisbee deportation as preventing what they might have seen as a necessity 2 years earlier, where it's the managers who have to leave, not shipping the workers out? And I think that casts the deportation in a different light, that it's coming in this context. So the Clifton-Morenci strike of 15 lasts about 8 months, and then they come to a settlement in early 16, but over the next year and a half, they still have dozens of work stoppages, wildcat strikes. They kind of never quit being on strike in a way. And then, of course, they also go on strike during the war era, like Bisbee does, like Jerome does, etc. Okay. Then I want to introduce somebody who I think is going to be a really important character in this book that I didn't think about before. 1933, the National Industrial Recovery Act passes, which gives unions, they think, the right to collective bargaining. That's shored up in 1935 by the Wagner Act. Bisbee, some folks try to organize a union in Bisbee and they go on strike in 34 and 35. And I write a little about this in my first book, but I've learned a tremendous more about it. They get fired. Among the people involved in that strike are Vern Curtis and his father. Vern Curtis goes on to be a very famous mine mill and steelworkers organizer. He is the organizer in Silver City in the strike, the zinc strike that becomes the very famous movie Salt of the Earth. Vern Curtis's father had worked in Bisbee during the teens and was deported. And then they moved to Safford and eventually moved back. And he and his father started working for Phelps Dodge again in the 20s. And so he's one character in the story. So what happens after that strike, for those of you who don't know, is that the workers who's been on strike are fired and they are also blacklisted. They can't get jobs. So now, though, because of the Wagner Act, there's a National Labor Relations Board. So they decide to challenge their firing and they file a case with the National Labor Relations Board, and it moves up the chain and moves up the chain. The NLRB rules in their favor. This is, FDR's administration, and Phelps Dodge takes it to the U.S. Supreme Court. Phelps Dodge has this young lawyer named Denison Kitchell. And Denison Kitchell is this slight, soft-spoken, ultra East Coast elite. He went to St. Paul's Prep School. He went to Yale, which is where his father went to Yale. His father went to college. His father is a corporate lawyer in the oldest Wall Street law firm in the United States. He then, Denison Kitchell, goes to Harvard Law School, and he likes the West, though. So instead of taking some fancy job in Manhattan, he takes a job with the law firm that had been Ellen Wood and Ross, that had been in Bisbee all those years ago, that they had moved and put an office in Phoenix. And Kitchell moves there, and he's in his 20s. It's a year before the strike. The strike happens, and his boss says, "Look, buddy, you're the only one who knows anything about labor law because you just went to Harvard Law School, which is where they came up with these ideas. You go down to Bisbee and figure this out." And he had been a student of Felix Frankfurter's at Harvard Law School and had been a liberal Democrat. When he started working for the law firm that represented Phelps Dodge, he, by his own lights, he's been interviewed multiple times, says that he began to see the capitalist way of thinking and represents Phelps Dodge. Anyway, the point is this. Denison Kitchell is in his 20s. He's sent to Washington, D.C. to represent Phelps Dodge at the NLRB hearing and then at the Supreme Court. He tries to go see his old mentor, Frankfurter, and Frankfurter is furious with him and he won't see him for being a turncoat. Frankfurter writes the 1941 Supreme Court ruling, NLRB versus Phelps Dodge, which says that you can't blacklist people. And if you do, you owe them back wages. And so Phelps Dodge had to pay back wages of thousands of dollars to some of these guys who'd gone on strike in 35. Among them was Vern Curtis and his dad. So Denison Kitchell stays with the firm that becomes Kitchell and Jenks for the rest of his career. And he very proudly says that he invented labor law in Arizona, but then he also admits that he had the record for the lawyer who went up against the National Labor Relations Board the most times and lost every single time. And the point I want to make about that is that it shows you this is an era in which unions had not the upper hand, but they had say, right? And we know that one of the things that they did is dismantle the dual wage system. And they used federal tools to do that. The Fair Employment Practices Commission, Mine Mill turned toward, rather than dividing Anglo and Mexican American workers, trying to get them to cooperate and understand that discrimination was bad for all of them. Vern Curtis is very involved in that story on the union side, as are many other people. And Denison Kitchell is the leader of Phelps Dodge's opposition on that side. Denison Kitchell, fast forward, joins the Arizona Country Club. He's a East Coast WASP. He meets Barry Goldwater while they're playing tennis, and they become friends. Barry Goldwater, even though he runs Goldwater the department stores that many of us grew up with, he doesn't know much about unions because they didn't have a union in the department store. In 1946, there is a ballot initiative to pass a law making Arizona a right-to-work state, which means that people don't have to pay union dues even if they're in the bargaining unit. And Kitchell takes it upon himself to convince Goldwater of how important this is for a pro-business environment. Goldwater's on the Phoenix City Council by that point, and he kind of becomes Goldwater's point person on labor law. Goldwater gets elected to the Senate in 1952, and Kitchell is his right-hand man, advising him on those issues. Kitchell also gets very interested in international politics and coaches Goldwater on some of that, international relations. And fast forward to 1963, Kitchell quits his job at the law firm where he's worked for 30 years representing Phelps Dodge and becomes Barry Goldwater's campaign manager for president. And for historians, I mean, I just think this is an amazing story and it is a great tale because I think I forgot to say that along the way in the 1940s, Denison Kitchell marries Naomi Douglas, who's Walter Douglas's son. So now he's actually in the family, right? I mean, daughter, sorry, is Walter Douglas's daughter, Naomi. And I'll just tell you, inside baseball, among historians who study the rise of Sunbelt conservatism, there's obviously a lot of attention to Barry Goldwater, and there's a lot of attention to this kind of Phoenix. People called it the Goldwater Mafia, which was his Goldwater's kind of tight social circle in Phoenix. But the thing that I want to say in this book is that those historians tend to just look at Arizona starting in the post-World War II era, and they focus on Phoenix. And I think what they don't understand is that these connections still relate to the strength of the mining industry on the economy and politics in Arizona. And Denison Kitchell's really a figure where you can see that. Okay. So this is this amazing strike. I can't get into this, but this is very interesting strike in New Jersey of Phelps Dodge workers. And then there's this next phase, and I'll stop talking about 5 minutes because many of you know this era better than I do. But trying to look big picture at the whole story, I realized that 1967-68 are a huge, huge turning point. So on the one hand, we have the strike that starts in 67, okay? And in the book, I'm hoping to tell that story through Clifton Morency, where the New York Times New York Times Magazine has a front page story focused on Clifton Morency, which is how the nation learns about the non-ferrous metal strike, which lasts over 300 days. And in Bisbee with Clemente Soto's scrapbook, you may know the Soto family. Richard Soto actually was generous enough to share this with me, where his father, who was on strike, had 10 children, and the youngest still in diapers, went on strike and kept this scrapbook, which has 80 pages of clippings from all over the country about the strike. And that's actually how I found out about the magazine. This is a picture of the New York Times magazine article in Clemente Soto's scrapbook, which, how did he even get a New York Times magazine in 1968 in Bisbee while he was on strike? I'm completely fascinated by that. But think about what else, excuse me, is going on at the same time. In Clifton Morency, I'm sure some of you know the story, and if you don't, you should. 9 members of the Morency High School class of 1966 in March sign up to join the Marines. They don't get drafted, they enlist. And right after graduation in 66, they take a bus, all 9 of them, to San Diego for boot camp. The strike starts the next summer. Within a month, the first of those young men comes home to Morency in a body bag. The strike continues for almost a year. And over the next 2 years, 6 of those 9 young men die. So you have a town where everyone is out of work and 9 members of the high school class of 66 are at war. There's lots of others, right, who are drafted, but these 9 who enlist together, 2/3 of them do not survive the war, and 5 of those die while the strike is still going on. So the momentousness, the seriousness of this moment. And this is actually 1967 is the first year when Vietnam protests turned violent across the country. We have the assassinations that begin to happen, right? Bobby Kennedy, Martin Luther King. We can't forget that all of this is going on. And then at the same time that all of this is happening, you have this group who are classic. Some of them are joining the mine, or they've graduated from high school and they would join Phelps Dodge, but they're on strike. You have these patriotic young men who are Mexican American, Anglo, and Navajo from Morenci High who join the Marines. But you also have what folks call the Chicano generation. And this is the children of copper miners across the state of Arizona who become the first generation of Mexican Americans to go to college in large numbers. And one of them is my friend, I'll put her picture in here, Ofelia Cañas Marin, who I've known since I was 21. She grew up in Superior, so not Phelps Dodge, Magma, but she's one of these people who became an activist, went to ASU. So all of this is going on. You've got young men maybe who are on strike. You have young men serving in Vietnam, many of them not surviving, who are all from these company towns. And you have then also this cohort who are the first generation with scholarships, with Ford Foundation money to attend college. And they have learned at the knees, at the heels of their union parents. And they become the first Chicano movement in the United States. And they're organizing at ASU and U of A and Phoenix College and Pima Community College. And they create the Chicano rights movement. And they have sit-ins about unfair treatment. They do all kinds of actions. And the thing that's in, there's a few of them, right? We know they become an entire phenomenon. Christine Marin, who's from Miami. Ed Pastor, who's from Claypool, right, becomes the first Mexican-American member of Congress from Arizona. Many others, Alfredo Gutierrez, a whole cohort of them moved to Los Angeles from Clifton Morenci and become politicians and civic leaders there. LA Times writer named Gustavo Arellano wrote about them. His roots are in Metcalf. So they become essentially the first generation of elected Mexican-American politicians in Arizona. And that story to me, that comes straight out of mining towns, and it is distinct from other states where the Chicano movement was big, right? In California, Texas, New Mexico, those were mostly farm workers' kids. But in Arizona, they were union miners' kids. Okay, so that's kind of like when I'm trying to tell somebody outside of Arizona, what's the big picture here? That's one of the big pictures. All right, I'm going to finish in just a second. So here is one of their newsletters from Arizona State. And then I didn't even get to Plius. One response to the other thing that's happening after 1968, 1973 is the passage of the Clean Air Act, the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency, and there begins to be tremendous pushback against smelter smoke, especially in Douglas. And Phelps Dodge is deeply engaged. Very much of its work and concern, you can see it in its annual reports and in its archives, is about how to address the existential threat of environmental regulations that threaten employment and threaten the survival, particularly of the older smelters like Douglas. And that's how Plius gets created. Plius is hoped to be a kind of panacea that it can both be a cleaner new technology smelter at the Hidalgo smelter, but also because it is a brand new company town, it's non-union. And so it's hoping that Plius and Hidalgo can kill two birds with one stone, bypass environmental regulations that the Douglas smelter cannot comply with, and open a non-union shop. There are a lot of reasons why that doesn't work out, including that the technology never quite works the way that they want. The smelter there has to be shut down in 1984 to be essentially rebuilt. That's during the strike in 83 and 86. Here's a layout of Plius. Plius closes in 1999 and is purchased in the early 2000s by New Mexico Tech University to house a training and special ops center in the war on terror post 9/11. Here is an Afghan village, pretend Afghan village there for training. And then the end of the story is what happens with the 83 strike and the lean and mean era, as I referred to it, where management is focused on cutting costs rather than production. I'm happy to say more about that, but I'd like to stop and get your takes here because obviously I could go on and on. But I'm going to stop here. And if you want to ask me more about that later period, great. Otherwise, I can take other questions as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Katie. And you're welcome to continue about the 1980 strike. The audience is engaged, most definitely.
Okay, hold on. I'm answering Gary. Oh, thanks, Gary. Okay, I'm going to keep going then because I'll try to share a few things about that era because this is the thing, right? I'm telling people you guys are the most knowledgeable audience I will ever have. So I need your feedback, but I have the opportunity, which is so wonderful, to get into archives that not everybody is able to. So I also like to share that. Okay. So um I've really been struck by trying to look at the 83 strike. I don't want to say in a new light, but the best chroniclers of it are people that were involved in it so far, right? Or went through it. Like, so obviously, Barbara Kingsolver was there and Clifton Morency, Jonathan Rosenblum's Copper Crucible. He was working with Babbitt at the time. But 40 years later, I'm reading some of the materials they use, but I also have access to a lot of the Phelps Dodge internal documents where I'm seeing how they were characterizing it. And what I'm really struck by again is this real emphasis on what they called lean and mean management. And from a national perspective, I think what's really important to talk about with the Phelps Dodge strike is that in 1982, as many of you may recall, there was a 6-month shutdown altogether. Ajo closed entirely. Clifton Morency shut down as well. People were allowed credit to stay in their company homes, etc., but nobody was working. And that's the backdrop for reopening in 83 when the company, in the face of low copper prices and a newly antagonistic attitude toward the unions that was partly ideological in the Reagan era, said, we want you to contribute to your health insurance for the first time. And there was limits on cost of living adjustments and so on. Only recently have I come to think about the health insurance piece as something that I can treat as strange and interesting to today's readers. Many of us, I'm lucky, of course, to have health insurance through my job. We know many people don't have that privilege, right? And that one of the greatest benefits of working for Phelps Dodge was, in fact, the benefits, and particularly healthcare. And that part came as part of the paternalism of the company town ethos that dated all the way back to the evangelical roots of this company. And this is an era in which, like, for us now, even quote unquote liberals, in 2026, it's pretty obvious that employees contribute. We have a contribution to our health insurance through our employers. But in the 80s, it was actually the case that most public employees, that was not the case. Many, many union members, I mean, this has been an issue of AFL-CIO members of certain bargaining units even to today. This was a big issue for the GM workers. They did not pay in to their health insurance. It was zero cost, zero deductible. And so now we can say we've all kind of become inured to that world. But that was anathema to people who had PD babies, right? Who would talk about how in Ajo, somebody told me girls were free, but boys cost more because you had to pay for the circumcision. Or someone told me in Bisbee that it cost $1 to have a baby. The baby was free, but the little bracelet that the newborn had was $1, right? So this is a completely different mentality that seems like a small thing to us now, but I think is an indicative of the enormous change in sensibilities on both sides. So I want to pay a lot of attention to 1982 and, of course, to the strike and how both sides saw it. And then the last section of the book, as I said, was called Afterlife. And it looks at, sorry, these slides are a little out of order. It looks at what happens to Plias after it closes in 99 and becomes a training center. It looks at Bisbee's efforts. I look in detail starting from the 80s. I'm hoping to have a chapter on Bisbee's transformation to a tourist town. I've got some great oral histories and national media about that process. And then allows, especially for national readers or those of you who've not been to Clifton Morenci, because it is not a tourist spot, to understand that it is still in 2026 a real company town with company housing. You know, they don't have a PD Merck anymore. It's a Bash's. It closed in the 90s. But the hotel is still owned by Freeport McMoran. The community center is still owned by Freeport McMoran. There is no incorporated government in Morenci. The website for Morenci is morencitown.com, not .gov. A lot of people realize these places don't exist. And the reason why that matters is because there's lots of talk about company towns coming back, right? Elon Musk is building a company town. Parts of Silicon Valley and high tech are basically company towns. And I think we should be thinking about what are the roots. And if you were to Google new company towns, which I have, you'll find lots of articles about Elon Musk, etc. And what's astonishing is they'll talk about the past, and they'll talk about Appalachia, right? And they'll talk about Pullman, but they never mention the Western company towns, and they're still there. They're still there, and they still exist. So I'll stop there and see what you all think. Okay, I'm gonna stop.
Well, thank you so much, Katie. That was fantastic. And I was wondering if I was particularly fascinated with the Kitchell-Frankfurter connection. And I
Yeah.
was wondering if you could give our audience a little context that this was not Frankfurter's first encounter.
Oh, yes, I'm so sorry. How could I leave that out? Of course. So some of you know that and some of you don't. Okay, I'm sorry, Annie, yes. Okay, so the backdrop of that is that Felix Frankfurter, for those of you who don't know, was a Supreme Court justice. But before that, he was a young Assistant Secretary of Labor and a young professor of law at Harvard Law School. And after the Bisbee deportation of 1917, Woodrow Wilson called together what was called the President's Mediation Commission, which was a committee that he appointed to go investigate unrest in Western lumber, but mostly mining camps. And one of those, of course, was Bisbee. And one of the members of that commission was Felix Frankfurter. And as I and Jonathan Rosenblum and others have emphasized, Frankfurter was deeply affected by what he saw in Bisbee. And he has this beautiful quote that I had quoted in my first book, and I will quote in my second book, and that Jonathan uses as well, where Frankfurter wrote to a friend and said, when I look back on these isolated places, I'm paraphrasing, but pretty close, I see the democratic, basically he says, I see American democracy at play and in peril. And he says the industrial anarchies, the discrimination, the yearning to be free. And he sees the unrest in places like Clifton and Bisbee as a kind of microcosm over race and civil liberties and workers' rights in the United States in 1917. He also, I have now read in a few different places in the archives, in the papers that are at the Huntington Library, there is a widely circulated story that he was confronted while he was in Bisbee and threatened with anti-Semitic slurs and threats that essentially will do to you what we did to the deportees. And I don't know if that happened, but the fact that there was a big story about that. He also brought his assistant, who was also Jewish, a man named Max Lowenthal. And Lowenthal apparently just completely lost it, kind of had a nervous breakdown after Bisbee. It was very scarring for them. So Frankfurter, even though actually later in his career becomes much more of a moderate, he's not a labor liberal by the end of his Supreme Court career. Yes, when Kitchell rolls in his former student and is about to represent Phelps Dodge, 18 years later, 20 years later, I guess, he's like not having it, right? He can't help but think about what he's seen in Bisbee as he's writing the majority ruling against Phelps Dodge in 41. Does that help answer it, Annie?
Oh, most definitely.
Good.
Yeah,
Thank
it
you.
definitely.
Thank you very much for reminding me to share that part of the
Oh,
story.
no problem. Thank you. Um, we have a question from Chris. Did your research reveal any PD company policies where debt owed by miners to the PD mercantile store was used as leverage against unionization?
Oh, absolutely. But it's a complicated story because, yes, of course, 100%. And people would be deeply in debt. And it's not just PD Merck, it's company housing. This is, especially in Morenci, that you can look at paternalism a couple different ways here, right? Like during until the 83 strike, which was another huge turning point, Phelps Dodge would let its striking workers stay in company housing, which seems pretty generous, right? Like you're striking against us and we're going to let you stay. On the other hand, it meant that they had big bills they had to pay back when they came back, right? So it kind of cut both ways. And that was absolutely the case. Matter of fact, in the 67-68 strike, another interesting wrinkle, if for those of you who read my first book and I read about the New Deal and the control Phelps Dodge had over local New Deal programs, in 67-68, that was a national non-ferrous metal strike. So there were copper workers on strike in Montana and Utah, etc. And some of the other states allowed striking workers to collect welfare benefits while they were on strike, but Arizona law does not allow them to, which meant that they were deeper and deeper and deeper in debt because they weren't getting these welfare benefits. And I suspect that Phelps Dodge and the copper industry had something to do with that, being Arizona state law as compared to other places. Um, I feel like there was one other thing I was going to add. Oh, one other thing I just wanted to share with you because I actually just learned this in my research this fall. My chapter on the 67-68 strike is going to be called the Gentleman's Strike because I talked to this retired, fantastic miner in Ajo who was a foreman, so he did not go out on strike, but he said that they called the 67 strike the gentleman's strike because everyone was very cordial to each other. The guys would be out with like pot-bellied stoves out on the picket line, and they'd share a cigarette with the foreman as they were walking into the company gates, and maybe share a cup of coffee, and it was very cordial. But that was really the end of an era. That was the last strike that was like that.
And our friend Camila from Ireland has a question for you. She's a member of the Higgins family. Um, she asks, was religious discrimination a feature of the decision making by Phelps Dodge in who were afforded opportunities in mining and for others, and personal control of their little business and life opportunities and work in the mining industry, in Bisbee in particular?
I think no. So one of the things I'm trying to do is that some people who write about company towns are um, so knee-jerk against the companies that it can be hard to show the complexity. And I think those of you who know me know my politics are pretty left, but I also think that Phelps Dodge is really fascinating because I think they were really sincere about their paternalism. And my sense is that they were really happy if anyone was religious at all, which is rather unusual given that they were really old-time Presbyterians. But as many of you know, they were very supportive of the Catholic Church in Morenci and in Bisbee, the examples I'm using here. And, a lot of that is that they use the Brophy family as kind of their proxy in the Catholic community. So I don't get a sense of a lot of religious discrimination, no.
I was also wondering if you could let us know a little bit about the archives,
Yeah.
kind of the scope, the date range,
Oof.
anything you'd like to share.
So I have looked at more than 2 dozen archives, dozens of archival collections. The most important for me are So I gave a talk on this a couple times in Bisbee, right? I gave one for you and one at the library about the British documents, right? The James family has an archive in England that I was able to go to, which was very posh to go to a manor house and be like I was, very fancy and read their papers. That helped me with the 19th century stuff. The New York Public Library in Manhattan, in Midtown Manhattan, has Phelps Dodge's corporate papers up till about the 1870s. And those were donated when Phelps Dodge moved its headquarters from New York to Phoenix in 1987. The other collections that have been really extraordinary for me is I had a small fellowship to spend a month at the Huntington Library last summer. And like I mentioned, the papers of Robert Cleland, who was a professor and a dean at Occidental College and then worked at the Huntington Library. His papers are there, and he was a classmate of Cleveland E. Dodge, Princeton class of 1909, and was hired by Cleveland E. to write a corporate history of Phelps Dodge, which many, many of you will have seen. There's 2 or 3 copies at the Copper Queen Library. There's some at the museum. That was published by Knopf in, I think, 1952. And that collection, I only read it last summer, but I probably could have written half the book just with that and not have done all the other years and years of research I had, because that is a very, very rich collection because he had access to a ton of stuff through by being hired by Phelps Dodge. And that includes these amazing telegrams and letters that are from top officials during the strikes. They are things like Arthur Curtis James visiting Bisbee in 1904 and writing about labor organizing then. They are saying very explicitly that Mexicans want higher wages and don't like discrimination. I mean, really smoking gun kind of stuff. He also had access to the papers of this guy. And again, those of you like Gary will know this guy named Arthur Train Jr., who was hired in the 40s to write a history of Phelps Dodge that was never published. There's a couple pieces of it that were published. He has all of Arthur Train's manuscripts and notes in his collection. And I think what becomes clear is that Arthur Train was not friendly enough about the company. And so in that collection, there are, for example, drafts of Arthur Train's chapters that were sent out to various Phelps Dodge officials for comments, and I have their edits. And like there's a note back, I can't remember who it is. It's somebody y'all would know. One of the general managers wrote back and was like, I think this is a little too much detail about 1917. Maybe scale it back. And basically none of that gets published, but then Cleland has it for sources. Arthur Train had this full-time assistant. I mean, these guys were really well funded by Phelps Dodge, who interviewed all kinds of people. So they interviewed people that had been in Bisbee and Clifton since the 1880s, and their interviews are in this collection. So that collection is absolutely amazing. And then the last collection that I would say is just recent that has transformed the book. Yes, thank you, Gary. I'm excited that you're excited about the Kitchell thing. I feel like that just like blew open. Denison Kitchell was, first of all, he wrote a history of the law firm. So in the 80s, so he collected a ton of material about all of their work for Phelps Dodge. They have a collection, the law firm has a collection, and then there are like 3 or 4 really in-depth oral histories with Denison Kitchell that I've used where he does not have a small opinion of himself. In all 3 of those oral histories, he says he's the father of Arizona labor law. And he's like, well, I was the only one who knew anything about it. And I invented it. That's what he says. I invented Arizona labor law. And so to be able to connect him to Goldwater to me is just an incredibly interesting through line for the book. And the fact that he married Walter Douglas's daughter is just like the icing on the cake.
And do you have time for 1 or 2 more questions? I don't want to impose upon your time.
Yeah, I do.
Okay.
One or two, no more
Okay.
than that.
Okay. When do you project that the book will be published? And is there a pre-order option or a list?
Oh gosh, I wish I could tell you. I wish I could. So here's where I'm at. This is a really fantastic opportunity, and I think for me, but also I think for I just want to say for us, like who care about this history, a kind of big time agent reached out to me and he wants to represent me. But that is a very new process. And he is essentially, I am currently writing, Gary, I would say that the secretary is still essentially a member, but I guess I'll be careful about that when I write. Sorry. Um, um, I have been writing this thing that I'm comparing to like knitting a scarf that just gets longer and longer and has a lot of slip stitches, which is that I am now on like, I've written 100 pages of this proposal. I have to write this really long, detailed proposal that then goes out to the editors at different presses, and I have to sell the book. And then I have to write the book. But I guess the good news is that after writing a 100-page proposal, the book is about a third written. Um, I think it's going to be a few years, but let's just say that it is really definitely in process. I hope we sell the book this spring, and then I'll have a real timeline. I'm working on the book full time this spring, summer, and fall. I'm not teaching in the fall either. I've been extremely blessed to get a lot of release time from Georgetown for working on this book, which I think reflects their belief that it's important, and I feel really gratified by that. So this is my full-time endeavor right now.
Okay, and I guess I saved a complex question for the last question, so I apologize. And if you need to cut it short, don't hesitate. Um, but would you kindly talk about racism and at the time, because now it seems as though ethnicity and religion seem to be linked together.
Sorry, I'm writing back to go. I'm sorry. Repeat about racism and religion. Is this the Kelly question that I just looked at very briefly?
Yes, uh-huh,
Okay, repeat it for me again because I want to make sure I answer it
of course.
to the best of my ability.
Can you talk about racism and at the time as now, um, were ethnicity and religion, did they go together? Were they linked
Oof.
together?
Yeah, that's a really long question. I guess I will punt and say that if you haven't read my first book, Borderline Americans, that is a major topic of it. And while I absolutely talk about race in this book, I focus that's something I explore much more deeply in my first book, which, I share with you all in my biography as a history of Cochise County. But what I tell, national audiences is a history of race that's a case study. And I look at the ways that um, elite Mexicans who in Mexico, for example, think of themselves as Blanco and white and Spanish, come to be seen as not white, whereas Southern and Eastern Europeans who are discriminated against, nevertheless end up as white in the kind of racial lines by the 1930s. And just to review that material, I argue that two things contribute to that. And one is the dual wage system is both reflective and constructive of racial difference, as are those translate, for example, like I mentioned, when Phelps Dodge and other mining companies are deeply, deeply involved in the local provision of New Deal programs, those programs are segregated in Arizona by Mexican and white American. And those further, you basically, maybe someone Slovenian is discriminated against, but they end up in the white bucket, as it were, and they get higher wages eventually, and they also get better relief in the New Deal. That's the short answer. I have to end here now, but I guess I am in this book thinking a lot about what I can say about national history of capitalism and the role of the federal government and unions in fighting racism. Um, that's going to be kind of the bigger frame of how I address that in this book. I'll say one more thing because I sense some interest in Denison Kitchell, and it's related to this. Kitchell also, if you know anything about Goldwater, infamously, he was opposed to the Civil Rights Act, but he also personally, people would emphasize he integrated the Arizona National, was it the National Guard? It was actually the Air Force, National Guard, I think. Yeah. And he was kind of known on a personal level not to be racist, but he opposed the Civil Rights Act. Dennis and Kitchell took credit for that. And Kitchell said he was the one who convinced Goldwater to oppose the Civil Rights Act because he said that he thought the public accommodations clause was unconstitutional, where you had to integrate public accommodations. And I think that's pretty rich when we know about the segregation in Phelps Dodge mining towns. And for example, like the creation of the Clifton Social Club in Clifton, where Mexican Americans could meet and hang out because they were segregated from the Elks Club, etc., and from the swimming pools, etc. So I think we can bring in mining town segregation into the story of racism through Dennis and Kitchell as well.
Well, thank you so much,
Okay.
Katie. You're
Thank you, everyone.
it's just always a pleasure to have you come share your time and your knowledge with us. Thank you again.
Thanks. I'm writing one more thing.
Well,
All right. Feel free, anyone, to, reach out to me. Because I love to hear from people and keep me accountable. So thank you.
and thank you to our audience for joining us. And I hope you can join us for our next online program. That will be Saturday, March 14th. Have a great Saturday, everyone. Bye.